First thing I noticed wasn't the house, it was her hands. She was crouched near the front steps, scrubbing the stone with a stiff brush, and even from the end of the driveway I could see the rawness of her knuckles, red and cracked, the kind of hands you get from spending too many hours in cold water. My daughter's hands. The same hands I used to rub lotion into every night when she was small, because she'd inherited my sensitivity to dry winters. I stood there on the driveway of my own property, the house I had bought, the house with my name still on the deed, and I watched my daughter scrub the front steps like a stranger hired to clean up before the owners came home. She didn't look up. That was the moment everything I had told myself for 12 years started to crack open. I want to go back to the beginning, because the beginning matters. Not the dramatic part, not the part people will want to skip to. The beginning, because if you don't understand where I came from, you won't understand the choice I made. And if you don't understand the choice, you'll think what happened to my daughter was something that happened to us. It wasn't. Part of it, and I have had to live with this, part of it started with me. I was born in Halifax, Nova Scotia, the second daughter of a woman who believed that work was the most honest thing a person could offer the world. My mother cleaned offices. My father worked the docks until his back gave out. We were not poor the way people picture poor. We had food, we had coats, we had a small house on a street that smelled like salt water and exhaust, but we had nothing left over, nothing soft, nothing that came easily. I learned to work the same way I learned to walk. It was just what you did. By the time I was 34, I had built a small accounting firm in Calgary. Not glamorous. Not the kind of thing that gets written up in magazines, but it was mine. 3 employees, a steady client roster of small businesses and contractors, and a reputation for being the woman who caught things other accountants missed. I was good at finding what was hidden. That part matters too. My daughter Iris was 11 when her father and I divorced. Not a bitter divorce, more like 2 people who had grown in opposite directions and finally admitted it out loud. He moved to Vancouver. I stayed in Calgary. We shared custody, more or less, until Iris was 16 and decided on her own that she wanted to live with me full time. That decision meant more to me than I can properly explain. She was a thoughtful girl, quiet, but not shy. More like she was always taking things in, storing them somewhere, thinking them over before she spoke. She had her father's dark eyes and my stubbornness. She grew up watching me run my business, watching me negotiate, watching me file and organize and track down discrepancies with a kind of quiet determination. I think she absorbed more than I realized. When she was 23, she met a man named Philip at a work event. He was 30, a project manager for a construction company, confident in that easy way that makes people assume a person is competent. He had a nice laugh. He opened doors. Her father liked him. My sister liked him. I had a feeling I couldn't name, something low and quiet that I kept dismissing because everyone around me thought I was simply being an overprotective mother. Maybe I was. I told myself I was. They married the following year. Small ceremony, beautiful venue out near Banff, my daughter in a dress that made her look like she'd walked out of a photograph I'd been saving in my mind for years. I danced with her. I told her she deserved every good thing. I meant it completely. 2 years into the marriage, I received an offer I had spent my entire professional life working toward. A firm in London, not England, Ontario, but London, England, wanted to bring me on as a senior consultant for a 3-year contract, working with international clients on financial compliance and fraud detection. The money was significant. The experience was the kind that could reshape the final chapter of a career. And Iris, my daughter, my practical, thoughtful daughter, sat across from me at my kitchen table and said, "Mom, you have to go. You'd never forgive yourself if you didn't." She was 25. She was married. She had Philip. She had her own job as an administrator at a medical clinic. She had a life that looked, from the outside, like something solid. I signed the 3-year contract. The house, the one I owned outright, the one I had paid off 4 years earlier, a 5-bedroom property in a good neighborhood in northwest Calgary, I transferred into a shared arrangement with Iris, not a sale, not a gift, exactly. A legal arrangement through my solicitor that put her name on the property while protecting my right of return. My solicitor at the time, a careful woman named Anne, whom I trusted completely, drafted the paperwork. Iris and Philip moved in. I flew to London in September. The first year was good. We video called every Sunday. Iris looked happy. She told me about the garden she was planting in the backyard, about the neighbors she'd met, about a promotion Philip was up for. I could hear her moving around the kitchen while we talked, the familiar sound of her opening the refrigerator, the kettle going on, small domestic sounds that made me feel she was safe. The calls started spacing out in the second year. She said she was busy. Philip had gotten the promotion. They were renovating the basement. Her schedule at the clinic had changed to include weekends. I accepted all of this because it was plausible, because I knew how quickly life fills up, because I did not want to be the mother who couldn't let her daughter breathe. Then the calls stopped. Not all at once. Gradually, the way water recedes. First, it was missed Sundays with a message apologizing and promising next week. Then next week became whenever I can. Then my messages sat unread for days. Then a week. Then longer. I called her clinic. The receptionist told me Iris had left the position 8 months earlier. I didn't know that. My daughter had left her job 8 months ago and hadn't told me. I called Philip's number, straight to voicemail, every time. I called my ex-husband in Vancouver. He had a new family, a new life, and he told me he hadn't heard from Iris in over a year either, but he'd assumed she was simply busy. He said, "You know how she gets when she's focused on something." I said, "Yes, I know." But this didn't feel like focus. This felt like something else. I wrote letters to the house. Physical letters, because sometimes digital messages get filtered or deleted or blocked, and a physical envelope arriving in a mailbox is harder to ignore. I wrote 4 of them over the course of 8 months. I got no response. I want to be clear about something, because I know what the question is. The question is, why didn't you get on a plane? Why didn't you go sooner? The honest answer is that I was afraid of what I would find if I did, and fear, when it wears the costume of reason, is very convincing. I told myself she was an adult. I told myself she had her own life. I told myself that showing up unannounced would be controlling, would damage whatever thread was still connecting us, would confirm to Philip that I was the difficult mother-in-law he had always, with great subtlety, implied I was. I told myself these things for 2 years. Almost 3. It was my sister who finally broke through. She lives in Moncton. She called me on a Tuesday morning, Calgary time, and she said, "I drove by the house last week." She had been visiting a friend in the city and had gone out of her way. There was a skip bin in the driveway full of what looked like your furniture, and a woman I didn't recognize came out of the front door and spoke to the delivery men like she owned the place. It wasn't Iris. My contract had 18 months remaining. I gave my notice the next morning. The flight home from Heathrow takes 9 hours to Toronto and then another connection to Calgary. I sat in the window seat and did not sleep. I went through everything I could remember, every unanswered message, every reason I had given myself for waiting, and I started to understand what the shape of it was. Not the details. The shape. The way you can see the outline of something in the dark before you can see what it actually is. I had called my solicitor, Anne, before I left London. I had asked her to pull the property records. She called me back within an hour, and her voice, when she spoke, was carefully neutral in the way that professional voices get when the news is bad and they are trying to give you time to absorb it. Philip had filed paperwork transferring the property fully into his name 22 months ago. The filing cited a signed agreement from Iris. Anne said the signature was there, that it appeared legitimate on the surface, but that there were questions she would want a document examiner to look at. She said to call her when I landed. I called her from the airport before I even picked up my luggage. By the time the taxi turned onto my street, the one I had lived on for 14 years before London, the one where I knew the neighbor with the blue spruce and the family 3 houses down who always put their Christmas lights up in November. I had already spoken to Anne twice and a property litigation lawyer once. I had a plan. That part is important. I was not arriving as a victim. I was arriving as someone who had been patient long enough. The taxi stopped. I paid. I stepped out onto the sidewalk. And that was when I saw Iris, crouched on the front steps, scrubbing. She was wearing a gray sweatshirt that was too big for her, the sleeves pushed up, her hair pulled back with the kind of carelessness that comes from not thinking about yourself much. She was 37 years old, and she looked exhausted in a way that sleep doesn't fix. The kind of exhaustion that comes from being told daily that you are less than what you are. I stood on the driveway and I didn't speak for a moment. I just looked at my daughter and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, exactly what had been happening in this house, while I was on the other side of the world telling myself she was fine. She looked up. For a second she didn't react, just stared at me with an expression I couldn't read, her brush still in her hand, water dripping onto the step. And then something moved across her face. Something that started as disbelief and became, very slowly, something that broke my heart and put it back together in the same second. "Mum," she said. That was all? Just that one word? But the way she said it, like she had said it in her head 1,000 times and had stopped believing it would ever be said out loud, I had to press my hand against my mouth to keep myself from making a sound that would have scared her. I walked up the driveway. I sat down on the step beside her. I didn't hug her right away because something told me she needed a moment. That she was fragile in the way that things become fragile when they've been under pressure for too long, and that moving too quickly might shatter something. So I sat beside her and I looked at her hands and I said very quietly, "Tell me everything." She told me. It took a long time. We sat on those steps for almost an hour, and then I brought her inside. My house, my furniture mostly gone and replaced with things I didn't recognize. And we sat at a kitchen table that wasn't mine, and she kept talking. Philip had begun, slowly, about 18 months into the marriage, to erode things. Not with obvious cruelty, not the kind that leaves marks you can point to, the subtle kind. The kind where a husband sighs when his wife mentions calling her mother. The kind where he handles the finances because he's better at it and then the bank account she used to access requires a password she no longer has. The kind where her name gradually disappears from the decisions being made in her own home. His mother had moved into the property 6 months after I left for London. Just temporarily, Philip said. Just while she sorted out her situation. That was 2.5 years ago. She had not left. His mother, a woman named Cecile, whom I had met exactly twice at family dinners and found unremarkable in the way that dangerous people sometimes are, had taken the primary bedroom, not the guest room, the room that had been mine, with the east-facing windows and the walk-in wardrobe I had spent 3 weekends building out with closet organizers from IKEA. Cecile slept there. Iris had been moved to the smaller room at the end of the hall. When I asked why, Iris looked at the table. She said, "He said it was temporary." And then it was just how things were. The property transfer had happened during a period when Iris had been ill, a serious respiratory infection that had lasted 6 weeks. She had been hospitalized for part of it. Philip had brought paperwork to the hospital. He had told her it was insurance documentation. He had told her to sign. She had been on medication that made her foggy and trusting, and she had signed. My daughter had signed away the house while she was sick in a hospital bed, believing it was insurance paperwork. I kept my hands flat on the table. I kept my voice even. Not because I wasn't furious. I was furious in a way that I don't have adequate words for. But because Iris needed calm from me right now. She had not had calm in a long time. I said, "Where is Philip now?" She said he was at work. He came home between 5 and 6. I said, "And Cecile?" "She was in the house, upstairs." I excused myself. I walked out to the front porch and I called Anne. Anne had been expecting my call. I said 4 words to her: "File everything, do it today." She said, "Already started." Within the week, Anne and the litigation lawyer, a short man named Graham who had done exactly this kind of case before, had filed for an emergency injunction on the property based on the circumstances of the transfer. The signature obtained from a hospitalized person under pharmaceutical sedation while being told the document was something other than what it was is not a valid signature under Alberta law. That is not a gray area. That is fraud. It was also elder financial abuse under provincial legislation, not because of my age exactly, but because the scheme had targeted both my property rights and my daughter's, and there were provisions in the law that applied. Philip came home at 5:43. I was sitting in the living room when he walked in. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at me the way people look at things they believed they had successfully eliminated from their lives. I did not stand up. I said, "You should call a lawyer." He tried several things in quick succession. Surprise that shaded into friendliness, then friendliness into wounded confusion, then wounded confusion into the particular kind of quiet anger that men use when they are trying to make a woman feel that her response is the unreasonable thing in the room. I had audited enough fraudulent accounts in my career to recognize the stages, each one a different strategy, each one abandoned when it didn't work. Cecile appeared at the top of the stairs during this exchange. She was wearing a housecoat. She looked down at me with an expression that I can only describe as proprietary, the look of someone who has decided that belonging somewhere is simply a matter of deciding to belong there and waiting for everyone else to accept it. I looked up at her. I said pleasantly, "You'll want to start making arrangements." Graham served the papers the following morning. What followed was 3 months that I will not pretend were simple. Legal processes are not simple. Philip had his own lawyer. There were hearings. There were documents submitted and examined by a certified forensic document examiner who confirmed in writing what Anne had suspected, that the signature on the transfer paperwork showed signs of distress and inconsistency with Iris's signature on other documents obtained from her clinic's HR records from prior to her illness. Cecile left the house voluntarily before the matter was fully resolved. I think she understood, more quickly than Philip did, how this was going to end. Philip did not take the settlement offer the first time. He took it the second time, after Graham outlined the criminal exposure clearly enough that even a man accustomed to believing he was the smartest person in the room became very quiet. The property was returned to its correct legal standing. The funds Philip had extracted from the joint account during the marriage, Graham tracked them carefully with my help. Because I know how money moves when someone wants it not to be found, were subject to a financial settlement in Iris's favor. He was also charged criminally. I want to be clear about that because it matters. Document fraud and fraudulent misrepresentation are criminal matters in this province. The Crown Prosecutor's Office took the case. There was a process, and at the end of that process, Philip received a conditional sentence and was required to pay restitution. His professional registration was flagged. I am not going to tell you it felt like justice, because justice is a word that implies everything was made right, and you cannot make right what happened to my daughter in that house over those years. You cannot return to her the morning she spent scrubbing steps that were hers. You cannot give back the job she left because Philip told her it was better for the household. You cannot undo what was done to her sense of herself during that time. But the house is hers. Legally, clearly, completely hers. And Cecile is in a rented apartment in Red Deer, and I do not think about her very often. What I think about is the morning, about 2 months after everything was resolved, when Iris and I were in the backyard. She had started the garden again, not the one she'd planted before, that had been neglected into nothing, but a new one. She'd ordered seeds online, done research, mapped out where the light fell at different times of day. She had a notepad with a diagram of the beds. She looked that morning like herself. Not the version of herself I'd seen on those steps, hollowed and worn through. The original version. The one who had her father's dark eyes and my stubbornness, and who stored things up quietly before she spoke. She looked up from her notepad and she said, "You know what I keep thinking about?" I said, "What?" She said, "I kept thinking you weren't coming. I kept thinking I had misread you, that the mom I remembered didn't actually exist." I put down my coffee. She said, "And then you were just there, on the driveway, and you sat next to me and said, 'Tell me everything.' And I thought, oh, she's real. She was always real. I don't have a tidy way to end this. There isn't one. My daughter is rebuilding herself the way anyone rebuilds something that was taken apart carefully over years, slowly, with attention, choosing what to keep and what to let go. She is seeing a therapist in the Beltline neighborhood who she says is very good. She has a job she chose herself at a small nonprofit, work that she says feels like hers in a way things haven't in a long time. I live 2 blocks away. Not with her. She needs her own space, and I understand that, but close enough that when she wants company, she can walk over. And when I want to see her, I can find a reason. Some mornings I walk past the house and see the light on in the kitchen, and I think about how many mornings I didn't know whether that light was on. How many mornings I looked at my phone in a flat in London and told myself she was fine. She is fine now. She is more than fine, but I will spend the rest of my life knowing the difference between those two things. The front steps are clean, by the way. She planted a small rose bush at the base of them. It bloomed this past June. That's something I've been sitting with since all of this ended, and I'm not sure I've ever said it out loud in quite this way. Philip didn't wake up one morning and decide to destroy my daughter. That's the part that unsettles me most. He did it incrementally, in small moves that each looked, in isolation, almost reasonable. The password to the bank account, the mother moving in just temporarily, the paperwork slid across a hospital tray to a woman too sick and too trusting to read it carefully. Each step was calculated, and each step was made possible by something Philip understood very well, that Iris was a good person, that she extended trust because that is what decent people do, that her goodness could be used against her. I think about that a lot. I think about how we raise our daughters. I raised Iris to be kind, to be patient, to believe the people they love, and those are not wrong things. But I failed to raise her alongside something else, the understanding that integrity in a person protects them, that knowing your own worth is not vanity, it's armor, that a woman who understands what belongs to her legally and in every other sense is much harder to slowly erase. What Philip had was cunning. What he lacked was any real strength of character, and those two things cannot coexist forever. Cunning without integrity collapses eventually because it requires constant management, constant pressure, constant control of everyone around you. The moment I walked back onto that driveway, the whole structure started failing, not because I was powerful, because the truth was already there, waiting. I just had to arrive. I also think about my own choices. I was a woman who spent her career finding things that were hidden in financial records, discrepancies, falsified entries, money moved in patterns designed not to be noticed. I was good at it, and yet I spent 2 years telling myself my daughter was fine when the evidence of her silence was sitting right in front of me. That is not something I get to set aside. Intelligence without the willingness to act on what you know is not really intelligence at all. It's just information you're afraid to use. Iris is rebuilding herself now, and watching her do it is the thing I am most grateful for in whatever years I have left. She is not doing it the way people rebuild after something breaks cleanly. She is doing it the way people rebuild after something has been dismantled piece by piece over years. carefully, with attention, sometimes going back to a thing she thought she'd already put in place and finding she has to lay it down again differently. She has more patience with herself now than she ever did before. That patience, I think, is its own kind of strength. Hard won, the kind you can't acquire any other way. What I know is this. The people in this story who caused harm did not face consequences because fate intervened or because the universe corrected itself. They faced consequences because there were records, because there was a lawyer who knew the law, because I had spent decades learning how money moves when someone wants it not to be found, and because I came home. The outcome was not luck. It was the result of choices, theirs, and eventually mine. The rosebush iris planted at the base of those front steps bloomed this past June. She sent me a photo of it on a Tuesday morning with no caption. Just the photo. I looked at it for a long time,